So our next speaker is going to be Brian Hales. And Brian has published extensively on Joseph Smith and plural marriage. And he's currently working on a book-length manuscript exploring Joseph Smith's 1829 skills and those required to dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. He's a retired anesthesiologist, and with his wife Janice, will be entering the MTC on October 28th as full-time missionaries assigned to the Utah Salt Lake City headquarters mission to work with Rick Turley on the new Joseph Smith biography. So we feel very lucky to have Brian with us today. Brian's spoken at several of our conferences, but we feel especially lucky because we caught him right before he went into the MTC for his mission. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Brian Hales.
I'm excited to be here today to talk about artificial intelligence and the skills that Joseph Smith exhibited while he was dictating the Book of Mormon. See if I can get these slides worth. I think everybody agrees that Joseph Smith dictated all of the words of the Book of Mormon, and most people agree it was in about a 3-month period. But if we ask the question, where did all of the words come from, we get different answers. Joseph Smith talked about a supernatural source by the gift and power of God. But, of course, we understand most observers reject this, instead declaring that there was a naturalistic source. And there are 5 very popular theories. One is the Solomon Spaulding manuscript theory. One is collaborators helped him. Mental illness, he had multiple personalities, automatic writing or channeling, and then also that Joseph Smith's intellect was sufficient. And what we will see from this slide here is I have gone through and looked at all of the theories that I could find, and I've classified them with the left column being Solomon Spaulding, and then the far right is that Joseph Smith's intellect. But you'll see that over time, Solomon Spaulding is very popular from 1833 to about 1884 when they find the manuscript and discover that it isn't the Book of Mormon. And so you see this smattering of theories. But for the last several decades, what we find is that almost everybody is saying, yeah, Joseph could do it. Joseph Smith was smart enough to do that. And an example of this is from Richard Van Wagner's book. He said the main conclusion of current research is that there is no element in the Book of Mormon that cannot be explained naturalistically. And Aaron Shalev also summarized, he said, historians have long denied Smith the image of an ignorant rural boy who could not have acquired all the material that he would have needed to write the Book of Mormon. The problem with these naturalistic theories is that to date, none of them, with one exception that we'll talk about, have asked or tried to answer 2 important questions, which are what skills would have been needed to do what he did? What skills would Joseph Smith have had in 1829? So what I wanted to do is to look at or submit to 11 of the available free chatbots online and ask them questions to see if they could help us identify the skills that Joseph Smith might have needed. Now, I'm well aware of the weaknesses of AI responses. And I think everybody is aware of the lawyer that let AI write a brief which just made up cases, and of course he got in trouble for that. But I thought before we jump in with the Book of Mormon questions, I thought let's just informally test AI chatbot responses and check them for accuracy. And the first question I asked was, what skills would I need to safely anesthetize a person for surgery? As a retired anesthesiologist, I felt I had the expertise to judge the accuracy of the answers that were given. Pi said, whoa, that's a heavy question. And Poe said, I apologize, but I do not feel comfortable providing specifics. But we did get some very good answers. ChatGPT 4.0 consistently had the best answers. Now, these are the free ones. I imagine if we put money in, you could get a higher level from the others. But ChatGPT gave a very relatively comprehensive but completely accurate answer to this question. Then I posed 3 other questions to these 11 chatbots. I asked him, what skills would I need to be a chef in a restaurant? What skills would I need to fix an automobile? What skills would I need to play for the Los Angeles Lakers? Now, I don't have expertise here, but I could, based on my knowledge, identify egregious inaccuracies. Well, as it turns out, posing these questions to the chatbots, and incidentally, this QR code allows you to download all the raw data. There are actually 9 questions that I posed to 11 chatbots. It's over 100 pages. It's a PDF, but if you're interested, and I will show this again in a minute, but you can download and see all of their answers. But when I looked at their answers and checked them for accuracy, I found they were all accurate. I did not find any egregious errors anywhere in any of the answers. Again, acknowledging I'm not a chef, I'm not an auto mechanic, and I can't play for the Lakers, but there didn't seem to be any problem. So I came away from this exercise feeling a little encouraged that AI might be able to help. The question I wanted to ask AI was, what skills would I need to dictate in 3 months a 269,000 word book with the literary characteristics of the Book of Mormon? Now, the problem with this is the literary characteristics of the Book of Mormon. The reason this is a problem is that no author to date has given us a list. Artificial intelligence is trained on large amounts of data, often measured in petabytes, to understand existing content and generate original content. But there is no list for them to access, even as they search all of these sources. And as is always the case, garbage in is garbage out. If you don't have a literary list going in, it's not going to do a deep dive in analyzing the Book of Mormon to create one. It's just going to guess. And that's where the garbage out becomes an issue. So the issue of literary characteristics of the Book of Mormon is a real problem, except that for the last 10 years almost, the focus of my study has been to get information from these sources, from authors who have done so much great scholarship on the Book of Mormon. And by using their data and using additional research, I have been able to construct this list of over 30 literary characteristics, most of which are objective, some of which have some subjectivity in them. And I was able to isolate a number of these and use them to form a question. It's a really big question, but I'm going to read it to you right now. But this is the question I posed to the 11 chatbots. What skills would be needed to mentally create and dictate in 3 months without written notes or a book with 269,320 words using about 5,600 unique words, including dozens of college-level vocabulary words, and reads at an 8th grade level with the following characteristics: 77 storylines, 207 named characters, 44 social geographic groups, over 100 geographical locations in the imagined world, over 400 geographical movements by characters, over 170 original English proper nouns, over 100 distinct titles for the primary protagonist, 3 chronological systems, several lengthy flashbacks, 2 genealogies with greater than 20 generations, hundreds of ecological references, at least 63 religious compositions comprising over 87,000 words discussing over 80 Christian themes. Hundreds of parallel poetic devices like chiasmus, hundreds of intertextual King James Bible phrases, and discussing with precision subjects like biblical law, olive tree husbandry, and warfare tactics. Also, no full sentence edits are afterward permitted. Sorry, that's a mouthful, and yet it was the question I came up with to pose to these 11 chatbots. And again, if you're interested in the raw data that I downloaded, it's a PDF you can download here. It's rather lengthy, but it's kind of fun. This is a compilation of the most commonly mentioned skills generated by the different chatbots. And there's 15: attention to detail skills, biblical knowledge skills, creativity skills, discipline, stamina, motivation skills, editing skills, memory skills, mental focus skills, organizational skills, religious composition skills, research skills, speaking skills, storytelling skills, time management skills, vocabulary skills, world building skills. Now, so we have this list of skills that are estimated by the chatbots, many of these occurring over and over. What do we do with it? Well, I have a son-in-law who has a PhD in computer science, and he says, artificial intelligence is dangerous because there is no intelligence in it. And this is true. What we have here is a brainstorm level list of suggestions that have to be validated, and that's the next step. And so how do we test the accuracy of this? Well, it isn't that easy, but it also isn't impossible. And I have 4 suggested validations. And the first is, I apologize, but it's myself. I have written 3 books that are over 500 pages, and the problem is I didn't dictate them. I wrote them, and I didn't do it in months. I did it in years. But for whatever it's worth, and feel free to disagree that I have the expertise, but I really do think that all of these skills would be needed to dictate a book like Joseph Smith did. I think a second place where we can find validation of this list is by going to books about extemporaneous speaking or about book writing. And if they don't have a chapter or a section on many of these or most of these, just look in the index. And we find that there's emphasis on paying attention to details and the importance of editing and extemporaneous speaking skills, time management skills while you're doing writing or composing a book. These are advice for authors that are mentioned there. I think they validate this list. But the third validation comes from the fact that if somebody wants to disagree, let's say we think AI is wrong about organizational skills or time management skills, they have to, the person who disagrees has to create an argument, a persuasive argument, that Joseph Smith could have dictated the Book of Mormon without that skill, without organizational skills or editing skills. I don't think that those arguments can be constructed that would be persuasive, but if somebody has the argument, let's hear it. The fourth validation comes from an unexpected source. It comes from a book by William L. Davis. It came out in 2020. It's called Visions in a Seer Stone, and it is the first book ever written to examine the origin of the Book of Mormon through the lens of the skills that would be needed. And in this, William Davis is a pioneer, and this book is a great step forward in us trying to understand how Joseph Smith did it. However, there are some important problems. Visions in a Seer Stone claims that Joseph Smith had highly developed skill of laying down heads in 1829. And that skill, laying down heads, is how Joseph Smith was able to create the Book of Mormon. And that he had developed this skill before, of course, dictating it to his scribes. He started dictating to Emma. Now, what is laying down heads? What is this skill? It's actually 3 or 4 skills. You make a mental outline and you memorize it. And then you recall it while you're speaking, and then using extemporaneous speaking skills and all of the other things you've memorized about that topic, you expand the outline. That's laying down laying down heads. But what I also noticed, because I've spent a lot of time in this book, having reviewed it for Interpreter, is that the book portrays Joseph Smith displaying 12 of these skills, even if it only mentions 3 of them, and tries to tell us how Joseph obtained those skills. And you can see the page numbers here where the book assumes Joseph is paying attention to detail and that he has editing skills and that he is managing his time appropriately. These kind of skills are portrayed in the book. And so I think this is an additional validation of at least 12 of the 15 of these skills. The problem with this book is, among several, that it doesn't provide historical documentation for where Joseph Smith learned his editing skills, for example, or time management skills, or vocabulary and language skills. And I'd like to talk about this just a little bit because laying down heads was a very common technique used by revivalist preachers. But the skill requires years of practice. It's not something that people develop overnight or by simply attending a simple lecture and mimicking a revivalist preacher. John R. Anderson, who writes textbooks for college students, said it requires at least 100 hours of learning and practice to acquire any significant cognitive skill to a reasonable degree of proficiency. So when we look at these skills that are demonstrated, we also can look in the historical record to try to find where Joseph Smith spent the time to develop the skills that he exhibited as he's dictating the Book of Mormon. The problem with the idea of Joseph Smith having developed this is that Richard Bushman observes that Joseph Smith is not known to have preached a sermon before the church was organized in 1830. He had no reputation as a preacher. And so we go back to Visions in a Seer Stone to say, okay, Joseph isn't learning these skills of laying down heads by practicing them as a revivalist preacher would practice them. So what is the evidence? And I want to sidebar just for a second to analyze this, because when we look at this book, even though I love the fact that it's approaching Joseph Smith's production of the Book of Mormon through the lens of skills, there are problems with how it is, the assumptions that are being made. The primary evidence that Joseph Smith was highly skilled in laying down heads in 1829, the evidence that's presented in Visions in a Seer Stone is Joseph Smith's 1832 history. Now that's a little odd that we'd go 3 years later to determine skills before that. But Visions in a Seer Stone mentions laying down heads over 100 times and mentions Joseph Smith's 1832 history more than 40 times as supportive historical evidence. Well, what is there in this history that makes us think that he can lay down heads? Well, what we do is we look at the very first paragraph, and there are headings there. I count 9. And so what we would expect if Joseph Smith were highly skilled in laying down heads is that he would use this outline through the rest of the narrative. But what we discover is that simply doesn't happen. We find that the first paragraph outline of 9 things, that the last 3 are not used. Now that may be because Joseph Smith didn't have time to do it. But we find very specific topics covered in the remaining narrative that are not forecast in any way in the original paragraph. In other words, if he's laying down heads, those heads are not very specific, and they aren't able to trigger what he is actually talking about later. And it's kind of interesting because Joseph Smith had this document in front of him. He wrote about half and dictated about half to Frederick G. Williams, who was the scribe for the first paragraph. But we see several topics that are covered in the remaining narrative that are not forecast, and we also notice that the order gets kind of jumbled up. But there's another problem. Look at how long this document is. Together with the first paragraph, we have just over 2,000 words. This is a very small sampling to draw the conclusion that Joseph Smith is highly skilled in laying down heads. And you could argue that this is an example that he either didn't know anything about laying down heads, or if he did, he chose not to use it while he was constructing this narrative. Now, there's one additional problem with this approach in Visions in a Seer Stone, and it's simply that additional evidence is presented from an 1843 discourse and an 1844 discourse to tell us what skills Joseph had in 1829. You can see that there is simply a problem with assuming skills couldn't have been learned in the interim. So, getting back to this, we do find Visions in a Seer Stone describing Joseph with having many of the skills that AI predicted. Not all of them. We see discipline, we see mental focus, and world building are not mentioned in the book, but the others are there and defended, or at least assumed. So, we're back to the list of 15 AI-generated suggestions. What can we do with this now? Well, remember from the original graph that the most popular theory advanced by naturalists today assumes Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon using his own intellect, using his own natural skills. Well, what skills would they be? Well, they might be these skills. Again, without defining what that is, and I hope the future dialogue will try to do so, what we are finding is this is a pretty good list that the naturalists may be at least implying or assuming Joseph Smith had and was able to use. And so let's go to the historical record and let's see what it says about Joseph Smith's skills, those that we can document. And we're so grateful to Dan Vogel for the Early Mormon Document Series. We're grateful for the Joseph Smith Papers Project and the Church History Library and other repositories that are allowing us such great access. And by accessing these sources, I have for the last several years put together a database of over 150 references to Joseph Smith's education, intellect, or oratorical abilities. So we can just go to this database, and it will be Appendix D in a book that is going through editing now, hopefully be out in the next year, and you'll be able to see all of these. But we can go to this database and we can discover the historical Joseph, at least the Joseph as described by eyewitnesses in historical documents, and we can determine whether he had the skills that are mentioned by the AI chatbots. In the interest of time, I've had to kind of group some of them together, but many of the reports that we find, maybe most of them are biased, but most eyewitnesses refer to Joseph Smith negatively as lazy, lounging, and idle. This is 1829. No accounts attribute the highlighted skills to Joseph Smith in 1829 in any significant degree. What we find are quotes like this. Michael Morris, Joseph's brother-in-law, he visited Joseph while he's translating in Harmony. When asked whether Joseph was sufficiently intelligent and talented to compose and dictate of his own ability the matter written down by the scribes, to this Mr. Morris replied with a decided emphasis, no. John Stafford, a Manchester neighbor, was asked if young Smith was as illiterate as you say, Doctor, how do you account for the Book of Mormon? He says, well, I can't. If we look at biblical knowledge, Joseph Smith read the Bible and he attended religious meetings. And I honestly think Emma undersold Joseph's knowledge of the Bible. But at the same time, we have no eyewitnesses describing him as memorizing portions of the Bible. This is kind of important. Gerald and Sandra Tanner, they're critics, but they have identified over 3,000 phrases that are similar between the New Testament and the Book of Mormon. So Joseph Smith is using the phraseology of the Book of Mormon. A more scholarly approach is from Royal Skousen. He found 254 phrases between 16 and 236 words from the King James Bible quoted verbatim in the Book of Mormon. Now, this doesn't necessarily surprise us because we all know that there are parts of Isaiah that are quoted in 2 Nephi and that the Sermon on the Mount is quoted in Matthew. But he also found over 40 of these phrases that are verbatim, and they range from 16 to 112 words that are exact same wording as the King James Bible. Did you know that 27 words from Exodus are quoted verbatim in Mosiah, or that 21 words from 1 Corinthians are in Moroni 7, or 36 from Micah and 3 Nephi. So whoever is dictating this is either looking at the Bible and dictating a phrase and then going back, or has memorized the Bible, or perhaps there's another explanation. What about Joseph Smith's editing or composition or vocabulary skills? Joseph Smith dictated 3 revelations and may have written a couple of letters before 1829, but no one describes him as educated or as even moderately literate. Literate, not that he couldn't read and write, because he could, but that he was not schooled in letters. Local district schools did not teach composition. Okay, Joseph never turned in a paper or an essay, a creative writing story, and get it back from the teacher with suggestions. The teachers were one-room schoolhouse teachers, and if they had that kind of training, they would have been closer to secondary schools, because that's where you would find this kind of training. John L. Gilbert probably only met Joseph once. He was the typesetter of the Book of Mormon, but he said Joseph and Oliver didn't know anything about punctuation. Chauncey Webb said, I taught Joseph Smith the first rules of English grammar in Kirtland in 1834. This is 5 years after dictating the Book of Mormon. So if he's learning English grammar in 34, how did he create the Book of Mormon? Now, he learned rapidly, is what Webb said, and this is important. I'm not saying Joseph Smith was dumb. He was very intelligent, but in 1829, he was not trained, he was not educated, and that once he had opportunities for learning, he learned rapidly, and I think Webb is accurate. What about memory? No eyewitnesses describe Joseph Smith possessing an extraordinary recall or photographic or eidetic memory. Orson Pratt bested him when learning Hebrew in 1835-36. And Pratt was a genius, but not a super genius. People who portray Joseph as a savant or a prodigy simply are going beyond the evidence. What about research skills? No recollections from Joseph Smith's contemporaries mention his visiting libraries or bookstores to read, borrow, or buy their books. We're grateful to Mike Quinn, who did exhaustive work on this, trying to connect the dots and place Joseph in some of these places. He never could do it. But we have great research from Michael on this. What about creativity and world building? Well, Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph's mother, recalled around 1823, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of travel, and the animals on which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular. The problem is that William B. Smith is the only other person to remember these. That was Joseph's brother, but he described how Joseph was incapable of authoring a history of a once enlightened people, their rise and progress, their origin, and their final overthrow that once inhabited this American continent. So we find in at least one of Joseph's brothers who's listening to these, he's less impressed with Joseph's overall ability. Emma Smith said Joseph Smith could neither write nor dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. Speaking, storytelling skills, Joseph participated in the local juvenile debate club and was a passable Methodist exhorter. However, the only person to mention his exhorting or his debating is Orsimus Turner. And in the same chapter where he talks about these two things, he says Joseph Smith was possessed of less than ordinary intellect. And a common problem I've encountered by critics is that they'll emphasize the positive things Turner says, and they ignore this and don't even tell you about it. Hiram Page, who was one of the 8 witnesses, said, "As to the Book of Mormon, it would be doing injustice to myself to say that a man of Joseph's ability could write a book of 600 pages as correct as the Book of Mormon." And I've tried to gather witnesses who knew Joseph and respond directly to the question of could he have done it, and that's some of what you're seeing here. So now we're back to the list of skills that come from AI. What can we do with these? Well, the reality is that the predicted skills do not match Joseph Smith's documentable skills. This is an AI fail. And that's where we are with it. At this point, I thought, well, okay, let me try to flip the question. Could a person with these skills produce a book with all these characteristics? Well, that's too bulky a question for AI, at least for the free versions. And so I thought, let's ask, has any highly skilled author ever dictated a refined and complex book of over 200,000 words in under 3 months? The only one of the 11 chatbots that connected this to Joseph Smith was LDS bot, and this is at Mormon R, the B.H. Robert Society. Josh Coates are doing a fabulous job with, and this LDS bot will write your sacrament meeting talk if you want it to. So you may want to take note of this. But the other chatbots didn't make the connection. Copilot said there isn't a well-documented case. iAsk said no concrete evidence. Gemini said no documented case. Claude said no well-documented case. Perplexity, no clear evidence. Pi said no documented cases. But Poe said, yeah, there is. One author, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, dictated the Gulag Archipelago, and it's over 2,000 words. Well, this is simply inaccurate. And ChatGPT, Meta AI, Microsoft Brie also listed authors who were supposed to have dictated as Joseph Smith did. But when you get in and look at the details, this is just inaccurate data. They may have dictated some of their books at times. Their books went through editing. They weren't first drafts going to the publisher as Joseph Smith did. So to summarize this last experiment, has any highly skilled author dictated like Joseph did? 7 of the 11 chatbots say no. And those saying yes offer examples that are inaccurate. I did my own literature search. I failed to identify any highly skilled authors who have ever dictated a long, complex, and literarily refined first draft like the Book of Mormon. We remember that today, the most popular explanation by the naturalists is that Joseph Smith had the skills. But we have shown that through this database that he didn't have at least the skills that AI has talked about. And the question comes up, if Joseph Smith did not have in 1829 the skills predicted by the AI chatbots, then what skills did he use to dictate the Book of Mormon? I believe that the naturalists, the atheists, the secularists, the empiricists do not have a rational explanation for the literary skills that Joseph Smith displayed almost daily for 3 months as he dictated the text of the Book of Mormon. There is a gap there, and this gap is not something that's brand new. What I'm sharing with you is not new. In 1888, J.H. Kennedy said this. He said, "Over that book and its origin there hangs yet a mystery, which many able men and women have sought to solve, which some have solved to their own satisfaction, but none have removed altogether from the region of doubt." Fawn Brodie, when she's writing her book, No Man Knows My History, wrote privately, "I am quietly tearing out my hair over the Book of Mormon again. Those chapters are the ones I have worked over the most and are the least satisfactory." And she never does get into the question of skills or how Joseph Smith could do it. She just said he jumped in and did it without any other explanation. Michael Coe, he's a critic, but he said this, "Even if it's all made up, to do something like that is really extraordinary. Really it is. I mean, if it's a work of fiction, nobody has ever done anything like that before." Now, Latter-day Saints have picked up on this gap. Profile of a Prophet, favorite talk from Hugh B. Brown. We have, of course, the famous Book of Mormon Challenge from Hugh Nibley. There are books that are written dealing with this same gap. They're highly devotional. What I'm trying to do and using AI to help us with is to come up with an explanation that is more objective and less devotional. to help us see, what skills would be needed, and to see what Joseph Smith did through the lens of the skills that are needed or the skills that are exhibited. Now, Latter-day Saints are going to see in this gap a miracle, and they should. President Nelson called the Book of Mormon a miraculous miracle. That's redundant, but President Nelson doesn't make mistakes. You have to think that is for emphasis. God promised in 1830 miracles. He said, "For I am God, and mine arm is not shortened, and I will show miracles, signs, and wonders unto all those who believe in my name." After discussing the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, he said, "It is proving to the world that the Holy Scriptures are true, and that God does inspire men and call them to his holy work in this age." These miracles, and I believe in the coming years, the miracle of the Book of Mormon is going to become clearer than ever before, and that it may even be like the brazen serpent that Moses raised up to those who had been bit by the snakes, and they were going to die if they didn't look, and some refused to look, but for those who would look, they would be healed. The obvious nature of this miracle is going to become clearer and clearer for those who want to look. But it is not for the unbelievers. They aren't going to be convinced, and we shouldn't expect that. Brigham Young said this. He said, "Miracles, or these extraordinary manifestations of the power of God, are not for the unbeliever. They are to console the saints and to strengthen and confirm the faith of those who love, fear, and serve God." President Howard Hunter said, "There will always be plenty of miracles if we have eyes to see and ears to hear." Thank you.
And I don't know if anybody's ever thought of putting Joseph Smith's skills through AI before. That's certainly a novel thing. In fact, my friends on, and I use the word friends allegorically, my friends on X, who frequently remind me how the church couldn't possibly be true, saw your topic and said, and thought that was, they even thought it was kind of interesting way to look at it. You obviously went in with some certain preconceived notions, preconceived ideas. What do you think surprised you as you were looking at this? What new things came to mind?
Well, great question. Let me just say that my first version of this a paper, and it's going to be published in December in Interpreter. My first version came up with all of these skills, and since I've been studying Joseph Smith's abilities and compiling that database, I knew that nobody thought Joseph had any of these skills, and I thought, wow, this is a big deal. And then I submitted a paper to interpreters, and the reviewers just said, look, AI has no authority. There is nothing authoritative about this list, and they just tore it apart. I'm so grateful to those reviewers because it helped me realize that if we're going to let AI help us with this topic, it's mostly just to get us talking about skills. I hope in the future no one can say, yeah, Joseph could do it, and just put a period at the end of that. They have to say Joseph could do it because he had these skills, or because these skills are needed and we can show that he had them. But the historical Joseph didn't have those skills. And so again, we're bringing up and using skills to illustrate it with a greater level of detail than ever before. Than Hugh Nibley's challenge, Book of Mormon challenge, or profile of prophet. Those are kind of general things. Well, when we get down to skills, we're getting into details that help us see what really is happening here.
So it really goes back to, there's all different kinds of theories where the Book of Mormon came from. You have the Spalding manuscript, you've got the late war, you've got just the whole list. But the one that comes up over and over again was this was written in our time, for our time, is just the whole naturalistic explanation for it. You obviously don't buy that.
Well, in another appendix of the book, I go through what I call the black box explanations. And these are explanations that look at the output of Joseph Smith and don't have to tell you how Joseph Smith did it, because they look at the output and say, we know he did it because of the output, okay? And they'll say, I found all these parallels. Parallelomania is very common. The 19th century content is also a really common response to say, oh, it's too 19th century. But the problem is Joseph never said that the words that he spoke as he's staring at a seer stone in a hat, which is how he did most of it, according to multiple accounts, that word stream was a literal translation of what's on the plates. And it's a revelation. Joseph Smith gave the Book of Mormon as a revelation, just a very long one, but it's just like many of the other revelations that he gave. And I believe that the revelation is updated for the target audience. We see that historically in the scriptures. God doesn't give a revelation to somebody at one time period that is really meant for another, even if it's a repeat, as it would be here. I believe God updated that word stream. It's a revelatory process. It's supernatural. When people say that it couldn't include 19th century elements, they're making assumptions about the source. And if the source is revelation, as I maintain that it is, then you can't judge a supernatural process using natural logic. It just won't work.
I think people haven't thought through their arguments very well. They just kind of pluck it out of the air, and they just haven't thought. I mean, I always think about the whole hat, where I hear people say, well, maybe he had notes in the hat. And my first thought is, okay, so he had to pre-write the Book of Mormon before he wrote the Book of Mormon. And if his skill was not in writing, then why would he pre-write it? And secondly, how would he read it out of the hat? I mean, would he have a flashlight in there, a candle? Which is, I think it's just not well thought out. In fact, I know there's a recent podcast on another explanation where the Book of Mormon came in through a uncle or cousin. I can't remember. I was up on it, but where fellow went to school with Samuel with Spalding and
well, yeah. The Spalding manuscript still lives because there's two names. There's the manuscript lost, manuscript found, and I was actually able to go back and see the original. Cool. When we were in Kirtland for the Mormon History Association, my wife and I went over and saw it. It's great. But there are people who think there was a second manuscript. See, the Solomon Spalding manuscript is only about 60,000 words. The Book of Mormon is 260,000. So even if he copied every word, and there's no similar names, the styles are very different. The Book of Mormon is so much deeper and more layered than anything. It's a very superficial text that moves along. And there are a few parallels. And that brings us back to this idea that people find parallels and they want to say, oh, we know there's a connection. I mean, a friend of mine wrote a book about how Joseph must have read Jonathan Edwards. But he can't ever put any books by Edwards in Joseph Smith's hands. As you study the pre-1829 period, there's just no space for this. There's another new one that came out by Lars Nelson. He had found parallels to a book written, I think it was in the 1600s. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah.
And he wrote a book about it, sure that this is how Joseph got the ideas. Well, there's 77 storylines in the Book of Mormon, 63 sermons, 80 religious topics. There's going to be parallels to lots of things. And any book that's written in the same, vernacular as the Book of Mormon, as the King James Bible, is going to have similar phraseology. I mean, that's just the nature of it. So identifying these parallels really doesn't mean there's a connection there. That's a problem that occurs over and over.
Yeah. So another one, when I was at a Baptist, I was graciously invited by the Southern Baptist Convention to speak at one of their meetings. And they were wonderful people. They really were. They treated me with great kindness and respect while I was there. But the fellow there, his explanation, the question given to me at the time was, well, what is your explanation for the source of the Book of Mormon? Yeah. And the fellow who was my other side, my other part there, said, well, I thought it was Ethan Smith. And then he immediately modified that, saying, Joseph didn't copy Ethan Smith with View of the Hebrews. I mean, obviously not, but he just used it as a framework, and the framework is the Book of Mormon. But I think that's another one that just doesn't really work.
Well, again, you've got so much content in the Book of Mormon that finding a few parallels, and there are parallels, and B.H. Roberts, of course, made 20, but 77 storylines, over 80 topics, Christian topics that are mentioned over and over. These, even if it were true, Joseph still got to come up with 80 or 90% of the text. Where did the skill come from to do that? Maybe the remaining question. So.
Yeah, and then we have the John Smith Dartmouth College connection. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
Oh yeah,
that's. I mean, a whole podcast was done recently on that. I know.
Yeah, what that is that Hiram Smith attended the charity school that was on the same campus as Dartmouth. They were not the same school, and he would go there, and he was 12 to 15, and Joseph was 7 to 10. The theory is that Hiram had listened to all this great religious discourse and then took it back to Joseph, and people have shown parallels between the Book of Mormon or Joseph's later teachings and things that were being taught there. Again, it's a parallel theme. You can find parallels, and we know there's a connection, and they're trying to make this connection. But just think about it: a 12-year-old teaching a 7-year-old, giving them the ideas that he would need to later create the Book of Mormon when he's 23, or even if we stretch it to Joseph Smith being 10 years old and Hiram is 15 or 14. Again, it's not a strong argument, and certainly there's no other evidence other than circumstantial evidence. Richard Behrens wrote an article or two, and before he passed away in the 2000s, I remember talking to him at one of the history meetings, and I'm listening to his theory, and I'm nonplussed, and scholars have been nonplussed all along, but some critics got a hold of this and finds the parallels, and they become easily convinced that parallels mean a connection. You got to forge that connection historically, even if it's just one, reliable document showing Joseph read Jonathan Edwards, or that Joseph Smith read the 16th century scholar that I can't remember his name that Lars Nilsson mentions in his book, but forge a connection, okay? Because parallels aren't going to get you there if you look at the big picture. At least that's my opinion.
Every 10 to 15-year-old I know, every 10, 15-year-old man and young men's, they're all reading the 16th century books, and no, maybe not. I do have one more question for you. This one might be a little more difficult. It says the Book of Mormon treats the Tower of Babel and the confounding of languages as a contemporary literal event. Ben Spackman and others do not believe the languages are changed a singular event. What do you believe about this topic and how that works with the Book of Mormon?
I'm not a good scholar. I think I saw Ben out there. We should bring him in and ask him that. But for me, when we see this type of narrative in the Book of Mormon, whether I think it came from the brass plates and how it got on the brass plates, if it's recounting something that's entirely accurate, historically, scientifically, or not, I don't know to venture. I think I have a degree in biology, so I have problems with the universal flood, but we obviously have other ways to look at the language of the Bible when it describes at least that event. And I don't lose a lot of sleep over it, again, because we're talking about revelatory things, and they may be symbolic, they may be literal, but we shouldn't get hung up on something that small when we have so much more to try to enjoy and explain.
So you have the last word on this one is, what do you think how likely is it that Joseph Smith was able to write the Book of Mormon on his own, just from his own skill set?
Well, the reality is I don't think anybody could do this. Can I give an example?
Sure.
As my last thing. The Book of Mormon has 207 characters that are recalled 3,780 times with two possible mistakes. There's been a flipping of Mosiah and Benjamin.
Right.
Okay. There are 147 geographical locations that are mentioned 670 times with two mistakes. There's armies marching to the wrong places. Okay. There are 44 social geographic groups that are mentioned over 1,674 times with no mistakes. Put those numbers together, and what we have is over 6,000 recall events of over 400 names of people, places, and groups that are recounted with over 99.9% accuracy during the 3 months. It's about 75 to 100 names a day, if you just try to parse it out, that Joseph Smith is recounting with 99.9% accuracy. I don't think I think that's beyond human performance maximums, and so I don't even think that any person could do what Joseph did. So certainly he didn't have very many skills to begin with, but things are manifested in that dictation that would stress any genius level person who's ever lived.
And my own view on the Mosiah Nephi thing is, I think the original plates were correct in that's what the prophet at the time thought, because he wasn't there. He was away, and he didn't know that Mosiah was no longer there, and so.
Royal Skousen said the original Benjamin may be accurate, and that the switch wasn't needed. Don Bradley, I think, agrees with at least one of them. Joseph switched one. Orson Pratt switched the other one in 1849 as an editor. But again, the feeling is it may not have been needed, depending upon how you read the chronologies.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you, as always. We're going to take a quick break. Just a reminder, if you like presentations like this and you want us to do more of them, please donate to us. That's the only way we can afford to do this. We will see you at 1:20. Thank you so much.